So it's a very intensive, energetic process that we're talking about here with muscle contraction, and we need to have a good supply of ATP, right? Regardless of where we get it from. And we're going to talk about the sources. This isn't going to be an overly important part of the chapter, but I do want to at least start to introduce you to some of the concepts of energy production. Certainly will be covered much more when you get into metabolism in your nutrition course, and also there's a chapter in it later on in A&P2 that deals entirely with the production of ATP. So as we discussed many times, all muscle contraction depends on ATP because it is an energy requiring process. It's certainly not passive. And so what does ATP supply depend upon? Well, we must have oxygen. Again, this will become clearer later on why oxygen is required. So that's why myoglobin has to be there in a large quantity in order to contain the oxygen and to hold it so that we always have a good supply to produce the ATP that we need. Myoglobin then, as we already talked about, is that important molecule. We also need sources of glucose and fatty acids, and so that's going to be glycogen to a large extent. We're also going to be using triglycerides and so forth in order to make sure we always have enough of the molecules necessary to produce the ATP. So ATP in the cell, we have about 10 to 15 seconds of it to maintain our whatever particular energy we are expending, whatever particular activity we are utilizing. We have about 15 seconds. So if you all of a sudden decide to start a sprint, then you will need to have that 15 seconds at least. Then what do? Well, that's where we come to an issue about what we do after 15 seconds. And so there are two main pathways of the way we produce ATP. We have the pathway called anaerobic fermentation. This is not the preferred pathway to producing ATP because all we get out here is just a couple of ATP per a glucose molecule. That's not really efficient process. Also, you produce the unfortunate byproduct called lactic acid. Now, the other mechanism that's preferable is the process of aerobic respiration. And in aerobic respiration, we get up to 36 or 38 ATP, depending on the exact tissue. In skeletal muscle, largely around 36 ATP per glucose molecule. So in the first one, it's 2 ATP per glucose. This process, it's 36. So great deal more energy, and it requires oxygen to be present. Right. We're also going to produce just byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. That's fine. We can deal with those. We got mechanisms used for those. But we need that oxygen supply to continue in order to perform aerobic respiration. So this is a chart that's showing you aerobic respiration. We have that here. We have our ADP. We add a phosphate to that ADP through a molecule called a kinase. Kinases are enzymes that attach phosphate groups to ADP to form ATP. So this particular kinase called myo, and that would mean it's associated with the muscle, myokinase attaches the phosphate and we get ATP. We utilize it, it breaks down into ADP. Now, there's another way to generate ATP in the cells, and that's through kind of a different mechanism called the phosphagen system, where you utilize a molecule that you produce naturally called creatine phosphate. And in creatine phosphate, it donates a phosphate group, right, to a molecule called creatine kinase that then donates that phosphate group to ADP, to create ATP. So this is another way to create more ATP. So when is it used? What's the mechanism? As we talked about, we maintain enough ATP in our cells for around 10 to 15 seconds. This may be a little bit negative in that aspect, but 10 to 15 seconds we have enough ATP to do whatever activity we need to do. That's all the ATP we maintain. So we don't have a whole lot. It's a very expensive molecule. Remember, it has 3 phosphate groups. It's very energetic, which means it's unstable. It requires a lot from a cell to maintain much of this ATP. But we do have a lot of ADP. So it's easy to add just a phosphate group onto the ADP to create ATP. So it makes more sense, because ADP is more stable, to maintain much larger quantities of that in the cell. So you're sprinting along here, you're using your aerobic respiration for the first 10 seconds or so, then you're going to revert to that creatine phosphate molecule to supply your phosphates to create ATP. And then somewhere around 30 seconds or so, you're going to revert to what's called the anaerobic fermentation process, where we're not getting a whole lot of ATP from our glucose molecules, but at least we're able to sustain our activity. Maybe not at a high level like we'd like to, but we still can maintain it, and that's the important thing. The problem here is we're producing lactic acid, which has negative effects on muscle function. And you complete your race, and you finish it, and now you've got to breathe, and breathe heavy. And what you're doing is you're replacing the oxygen, not only that you need to sustain yourself at that moment, but also to replace all the oxygen you used here to create the ATPs during this process. You had a lot of oxygen you used here. It's gone now. The myoglobins are empty. We have to fill them up again, and that's called oxygen debt. So we have to breathe in extra oxygen here. That's why you really get to that heavy breathing, not only for your activities at the time, but for paying back the myoglobins that we have emptied here. So fatigue results from a number of factors, some more likely to occur than others. And what we know is that as glucose levels drop from the breakdown of glycogen, ATP production is going to decrease as well, because aerobic respiration depends on large quantities of glucose in order to produce massive amounts of ATP. Once you begin losing this glucose, you're going to produce much less ATP as you eventually revert to anaerobic fermentation. It'll slow down these pumps called sodium-potassium pumps that you probably don't remember much. We talked about them much earlier in Chapter 3 when we talked about active transport. And so during all of this activity, your nerves have been operating at a very high rate, and to operate correctly, they have to move sodium from one side of a cell membrane to the other, and potassium from one side of the membrane to the other. And when all this activity is over, we have to push everything back to where it was. Well, all of that takes lots of ATP, and it's just a further drag on your system. So you can get overly tired, partially due to this as well. Lactic acid lowers the pH of your sarcoplasm in your muscle cells, right? So what that does is it begins to inhibit enzyme activity. Now, I will point out that as you perform longer and produce and get used to this lactic acid presence, your enzymes will actually achieve better results over a longer period of time. So yeah, it's going to hurt a lot in the beginning and at the get-go, but once you've been into it a few months, weeks, months, then your body will accommodate the production of lactic acid to a higher degree. Fatigue is also thought to result from the fact that at the end of the motor nerves, where you're releasing acetylcholine, you may run out of acetylcholine. This doesn't happen very often. It's actually thought to be fairly rare. It's called junctional fatigue, and it just actually is very rare. There's a fairly significant factor for fatigue called psychologic fatigue, or in this case, central nervous system fatigue, where you just simply reach a point and your central nervous system says, that's it, buddy, stop. Really doesn't have a whole lot to do with your muscles and the way they're able to function. It has more to do with the idea that your brain just quits telling your muscles to work so hard. It's been hard to figure out. Not a lot of progress has even been made on that in the last few decades. So it's just one of those nebulous things that occurs. Your brain just says, that's it.